June 4th, 1942, for 30 hours. 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, on the flag bridge of the carrier Akagi. The air is thick with fuel fumes and salt, and the night wind carries the low thunder of engines warming below decks. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands with his hands behind his back, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the faint line where sea meets sky. Around him, staff officers move in tight, rehearsed patterns, passing clipboards and course boards, speaking in clipped phrases that vanish into the wind. The operation has been planned like a sword stroke. First the atoll, then the American carriers when they rush in. The Imperial Navy has done this before. Strike fast, strike hard, and the enemy breaks. But this morning, something feels wrong in a way nobody wants to name. A petty officer leans over a radio set, head tilted, listening to the hiss and crackle as if the ocean itself is whispering warnings. Another sailor, face slick with sweat, carries a message up the ladder and almost slips on the rung. He catches himself, breathes, and hands the paper to a lieutenant who reads it once. Then again, like his eyes are refusing to accept the ink. The scouts are late. One of them, the one that matters. Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, stands near the plotting table. His jaw tightens as he watches the time marks stack up. Planes have already been spotted over Midway. That part is normal. What is not normal is the feeling that the Americans are already in motion, already aligned, as if they knew the shape of the Japanese swing before the fist even moved. The first reports from the Midway strike come back ragged. Flak, fires, facilities damaged, but not destroyed. Not enough. Not clean enough. Kusaka leans closer to Nagumo, voice low so the bridge crew cannot hear the uncertainty. He does not speak of fear, he speaks of timing. The Americans are acting with timing that does not fit desperation. Their response is not the blind lunge of a surprised man. It is measured, coordinated, like a commander has placed pieces on a board hours ago and is now simply watching the trap close. You can feel the ship itself tense. Akagi's steel decks vibrate as flight crews below prepare to rearm and refuel. Bomb carts rattle. Torpedoes are rolled into place with grunts and shouted counts. Aviation gasoline fumes seep upward, sweet and dangerous. The smell of a blade being sharpened. Then the scout report arrives, late and lethal. Enemy ships sighted. The words are simple, but they land like a shell burst inside the bridge. The report becomes more specific. Carriers, likely. The Americans are here. Nagumo does not shout. He does not need to. Every man on that bridge understands what the sighting means for aircraft sitting below with open fuel lines and exposed munitions. It means seconds matter. It means decisions are no longer theoretical. It means the enemy is not where the plan wanted him to be. The enemy is where he should not be unless someone on the American side has read the plan. Kusaka watches Nagumo's face, searching for the moment the Admiral will commit. The order comes, and it is a pivot made under pressure. Change the loadouts. Shift again. Prepare for the carriers. It is the kind of command that can save a fleet or ruin it. Deck crews scramble as if the deck has caught fire. Bombs are pulled. Torpedoes are moved. Aircraft are pushed and repositioned, wings folding and unfolding like nervous hands. And then the sky begins to fill with American planes. At first, they come low. Torpedo bombers. Slow. Vulnerable. They are cut to pieces by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Japanese gunners exhale in grim satisfaction as the splashes erupt and planes fold into the sea. It should be a slaughter that buys time. But even as the Americans die, they are doing something else. They are fixing the Japanese fighters down low, drawing them away, pulling them into a chase where altitude becomes a luxury the defenders cannot afford. You, standing with the bridge crew, would feel it before you see it. The sudden shift in the sound of battle. The moment when everyone looks up at once, as if the sunlight itself has changed. Dive bombers. They appear high and steep, falling almost vertically, SBD dauntless aircraft, wings shuddering, brakes screaming, bombs tumbling free. The first explosions punch through the flight deck with an ugly, final thump. Fire blooms in an instant, fed by fuel and munitions that have been exposed by the frantic rearming. Akagi shudders. The deck below becomes a furnace. Men run, then vanish in smoke. The smell changes from salt and gasoline to something worse, a choking mix of burning paint, hot metal, and flesh on the bridge. The officers do not panic, but their faces harden into the same expression, disbelief turning into calculation. Not disbelief that Americans attacked, but disbelief that they attacked at the exact moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. Kusaka grips the edge of the plotting table until his knuckles pale. He does not say luck. Not anymore. Luck does not repeat itself with such cruel precision. Another blast rocks the ship. A runner stumbles, catches himself, and stands at attention out of instinct even as the world shakes. The discipline is real. But discipline does not stop bombs. Nagumo finally speaks. Voice controlled, but the words carry the weight of a realization he cannot yet fully explain. The Americans are not improvising. They are arriving on schedule, somewhere far away. On the other side of the ocean, an American admiral is coordinating forces across thousands of miles, aligning submarines, carriers, and land-based air so that Japanese assumptions become liabilities. The name is not yet spoken here with certainty, but it is beginning to form in the minds of surviving leaders like an unwelcome answer. If the enemy keeps striking at the right time, then someone is always ahead. And as smoke rolls across the bridge windows and Akagi's deck burns below, the first seed of that thought takes root inside the Imperial Navy's highest ranks. The bridge windows turn into a trembling wall of gray. Smoke swallows the horizon, thick enough that the rising sun becomes a dull coin behind it. On Akagi, orders still move through the ship because they must. But the rhythm has changed. It is no longer the confident tempo of an attack plan unfolding. It is the desperate tempo of containment, of survival. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo remains upright, expression carved from restraint. But every man near him can see how the battle has taken away choices. Flames roar up from the hangar deck like a living thing. Explosions rattle through the carrier's bones as aviation fuel finds heat and turns into violence. A staff officer leans in, voice tight. Damage reports. Fire mains failing. Aircraft burning. Casualties mounting. The words are clinical because the alternative is to admit what Akagi has become. Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka does not look away. His eyes track the smoke, the flashes, the glimmering shards of metal drifting down like deadly confetti. He keeps returning to the same thought, the one that gnaws at him as fiercely as the fire gnaws at their ship. The Americans hit at the exact moment, not earlier, not later. The one window when the carriers were loaded with fuel and exposed munitions. The one window that Japanese doctrine insisted they could control. Farther out, through breaks in the smoke, other columns rise. Kaga burning, Soryu burning. The air above the task force is crowded with debris and aircraft silhouettes. Japanese fighters claw for altitude again, but it is too late. The defenders look up and see a sky that feels owned. Nagumo's flagship is dying, but the battle is not yet done. Orders go out to transfer command. Boats are lowered. Men climb down ladders into a sea that reflects fire. The surface is littered with wreckage. Wood. Metal. Floating fuel that shimmers like oil slicks and ignites in ribbons. Sailors in kapok vests cling to splintered planks. Some are silent. Some shout names into the smoke. as if the right name could pull a friend back from the furnace. Kusaka follows Nagumo off the flagship. He steps into a cutter that rocks violently in the swell. He feels the heat on his face like an open oven door. Overhead, American planes still circle, and for a moment he waits for the next bomb to land in the water beside them. But the attack passes. The Americans have already taken what they came for. The cutter pushes away. Akagi recedes, still burning, still proud, still doomed. A Japanese destroyer moves in to take survivors. On its deck, men pull the rescued aboard with rope and raw hands. Some collapse immediately, shaking. Some stand and stare back at the carrier as if refusing to accept that an empire can bleed. Later, when the survivors are crowded into compartments that smell of wet clothing and smoke, the senior officers gather. This is not an official conference. Not yet. This is a handful of exhausted men leaning over charts that no longer match reality, speaking in voices that try to stay calm. Kusaka listens as another officer recounts the timeline. When the first American torpedo squadrons arrived, when the fighters were drawn down, when the dive bomber struck, each minute feels like a nail hammered into the same conclusion. Midway had been planned as a trap. The Americans walked into it and then turned it around. The trap was now Japanese steel in flames. A young staff officer, face pale, offers the oldest comfort: chance, bad luck, the fog of war. Kusaka does not snap at him. He just turns his head slowly, like a man looking at a child trying to explain why lightning struck the same tree twice in one day. This was not lightning. Nagumo sits with his shoulders squared, but his eyes have the distant focus of a man replaying moments he cannot change. He speaks quietly, almost as if he is speaking to himself. The Americans knew. No one answers at first. The room is full of men trained to believe in Japanese naval superiority. Men who have spent careers memorizing the sacred logic of decisive battle. To say the Americans knew is to suggest the enemy has penetrated something fundamental. It suggests either a failure of secrecy or a failure in imagination. And then someone says the most dangerous word in the room: intelligence. The Japanese Navy has its own tradition of secrecy, of compartmentalized planning, of assuming the enemy is less capable than the empire. But Midway has a way of making assumptions taste bitter. The Americans did not just appear. They appeared correctly, not with scattered forces, not in confusion, but with carriers placed where they needed to be, with timing that sliced into Japanese vulnerability. Kusaka presses a fingertip to the map, near the latitude line where the carriers met. He traces the movement of the American approach as it is now understood, and the line feels too straight, too purposeful. Who coordinated that? He does not mean which pilot, which squadron. He means which mind. Across the fleet, in other compartments, similar conversations are beginning. Officers of the combined fleet, men who survived by luck and by discipline, start to exchange glances that carry the same unspoken question. How did they know where we would be? How did they choose the right hour? At headquarters, days later, the tone shifts from grief to diagnosis. Reports arrive, interrogations, assessments. The name of the enemy commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet is known. Of course, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, a quiet figure in photographs. Not as flamboyant as some, not as loud as a conqueror. Yet his forces have fought at Coral Sea, then Midway, and the pattern is emerging like a bruise under skin. Nimitz does not gamble like a man throwing dice. He gambles like a man who knows the odds. In Tokyo, senior naval officers gather around conference tables, polished to a sheen that cannot hide the tension. The room smells of ink, tobacco, and the faint mustiness of summer uniforms. On the walls are maps of the Pacific dotted with pins that suddenly look too close to the homeland. A senior admiral speaks in measured tones, describing the loss as unacceptable but not fatal. The Empire still holds territory, still has battleships, still has trained aviators, though fewer now, still has pride. But another admiral, older, eyes narrowed, asks a different question. Why was the American response so precise? The room becomes still. Papers stop rustling. Cigarettes stop moving. Because if the answer is that the Americans have learned how to coordinate carriers, submarines, and land-based aircraft faster than the Japanese can adjust, then Midway is not only a defeat, it is a warning. The warning is that there is an enemy commander who is consistently one step ahead, and that step is measured not in miles, but in hours and decisions. Kusaka, in his own debriefings, chooses his words carefully. He doesn't accuse. Accusations would become a political fire. He offers facts, timelines, the sequence of attacks, the effect of American pressure from multiple directions, the impression of a coordinated plan that anticipated Japanese reactions. He sees a few listeners exchange glances when he mentions the American dive bombers arriving at the precise moment the carrier decks were full of fueled aircraft. One listener taps a pencil against the table, slow and steady. Then he stops, and his voice is barely above a whisper. It is as if the Americans were watching our signals. No one writes that sentence down, not directly, but everyone hears it. And with that, the Japanese Navy begins to shift its view of the war. Not fully, not yet. Pride is a stubborn armor, but the cracks are there, and through them seeps an unsettling respect. Respect for coordination, respect for timing, respect for the man whose name they begin to say more often, not as propaganda, not as a caricature, but as a problem to be solved. Nimitz, August 7th, 1942. Before dawn, the sea south of the Solomon Islands is black and heavy, as if it is holding its breath. The first American landing craft pushed toward Guadalcanal, engines churning softly, wakes glowing faintly with phosphorescence. Marines crouch low with rifles across their knees, faces smeared, eyes fixed on a shoreline they cannot yet see. Far away, in Japanese headquarters, the first reports arrive like a slow tightening of a noose. American forces have landed at Rabaul, under low clouds and humid air that smells of rot and aviation fuel. Japanese officers move quickly through corridors. Telephones ring. Runners carry message slips that curl at the edges from sweat. The Japanese reaction is swift, almost automatic, because the doctrine demands it. The enemy must be pushed back into the sea. The Southern Area Army and the Navy must coordinate to erase this intrusion. But coordination is exactly where the war begins to feel strange. On the evening of August 7th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa leads a force of cruisers and destroyers down the slot. He threads through island shadows, relying on darkness and surprise. His ships move like knives. At Savo Island, he finds American and Australian cruisers unaware, tired, unready. The Japanese strike is brutal. Searchlights flare. Shells slam into hulls. Steel screams. Flames leap up on the horizon. It is a victory that tastes like old confidence, and then, almost immediately, the victory turns bitter. Mikawa withdraws, as doctrine says he should. The risk of daylight carrier air attack is too great. He expects American carriers to be near, ready to punish him if he lingers. He is right to fear them. But as his force retreats, he learns something that makes his stomach tighten. The American carriers pulled back, not in panic, not in confusion. They withdrew with the rhythm of a plan. The landing is not abandoned. The supply ships remain, yes, vulnerable. But the carriers reposition with an awareness of threat that feels too clean to be instinct. The Japanese had struck a hard blow, yet the American operation continues. Henderson Field becomes the hinge of everything. The Americans build it, fortify it, bleed to hold it. Each day, aircraft rise from its dusty strip, and each day the Japanese try to smash it, to starve it, to recapture it. This is where Japanese admirals begin to feel the invisible hand. September 1942. On board the battleship Hiei during a night run toward Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe studies the charts. He has the kind of face that reveals little, but his eyes betray a constant calculation. He is tasked with bombardment, with crushing Henderson Field so Japanese transports can land reinforcements safely. The plan is simple on paper. The execution should be decisive. Japanese night fighting is supposed to be unmatched. But as Abe closes in, reports come in about American forces moving unpredictably, yet always with purpose. American cruisers and destroyers appear in the paths where Japanese commanders need clear water. American aircraft strike supply runs at moments that feel like they were scheduled in advance. Abe's staff tries to explain it as enemy vigilance, but Abe has been at sea too long to accept that as a full answer. The Americans are not merely reacting, they are anticipating. On October 26, 1942, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands erupts in the air. Carrier planes slash across the sea, and Japanese aviators, still among the finest, still brave, still deadly, begin to notice how the American formations have improved. Their strikes are not perfect, but they are coordinated. Their fighter cover is better. Their search patterns are smarter. The Americans have learned fast. Japanese pilots returning with bullet holes in their wings begin to talk in ready rooms with an edge in their voices. The enemy carrier crews are not amateurs anymore. The enemy seems to be getting stronger even as losses pile up. In Tokyo and Truk, senior officers read these reports and feel the shift. The Empire is used to a war where early momentum breaks the opponent. Yet here, in the Solomons, momentum is a contested thing, and the Americans keep arriving with fresh ships, fresh planes, fresh men, and an eerie sense of where to apply pressure. A Japanese admiral says it in a conference room with a map of the Solomons spread wide. Their command is unified. He means more than organization. He means the Americans are coordinating the whole theater. Submarines, carriers, land-based aircraft, Marines and Army units on the ground. They press from multiple directions, and they do not lose focus. And behind that unity, the Japanese increasingly sense a single guiding hand. Not necessarily one man issuing every order, but a command culture that makes timing feel intentional. In November 1942, the struggle reaches a fever pitch. Japanese leaders commit to a major push. The plan includes bombardment battleships, transports, and covering forces. Guadalcanal must be finished. On the night of November 12th, Japanese ships enter the waters off Guadalcanal. Rain falls in warm sheets. The sea is oily. The darkness is thick enough that ships can seem to appear from nowhere. Searchlights slice open the night. Gunfire flashes. Close-range chaos. In the savage melee of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders expect to dominate. They have heavier guns, better night optics, more experience. Yet the Americans meet them head-on with a stubbornness that feels almost reckless. Destroyers charge battleships. Cruisers trade shells at point-blank range. It is a fight that should not make sense in Japanese terms. And yet it happens because the Americans have committed to a principle that Japanese leaders are only beginning to grasp. They will trade ships to hold the field, and they choose the moment to do it. The Japanese transports are delayed. American air attacks pound them at dawn. Bombardment missions fail or are incomplete. The Japanese have the sense of repeatedly arriving just a little too late, just a little off balance. As if the Americans have read their calendar and marked the hours that matter. Vice Admiral Mikawa, hearing about the repeated losses in the slot, begins to speak with a different tone. Not the tone of contempt for an inferior enemy, but the tone of a man studying a rival. Their timing is excellent. Another officer replies, "Careful. Their timing is not accidental. They do not say Nimitz in every breath. In the Solomons, other American commanders are visible. Halsey, Kincaid, Turner. But Japanese senior leaders understand something deeper. These men are operating within a framework set higher up. The carriers are shifted between theaters. Reinforcements appear. The overall campaign has an unseen backbone. It feels like Pearl Harbor reversed. In 1941, Japan had delivered the surprise and controlled the tempo. Now, in late 1942, the Japanese find themselves fighting an enemy who keeps stealing tempo back. And in private moments, Japanese officers begin to admit what would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The American High Command is not only competent, it is dangerous. In a quiet room aboard a cruiser at Truk, after another punishing run down the slot, a Japanese staff officer spreads out a chart and points to the pattern of American strikes. He traces arcs where carriers might have been, lines where submarines likely patrolled. The pattern resembles a net. He looks up at the senior officer across from him. Someone is coordinating this across the entire ocean. The senior officer does not answer immediately. He listens to the distant sounds of the ship, the hum of engines, the creak of metal, the muffled footsteps of sailors who do not know how much the war is changing. Then he speaks, softly, like a confession. If their commander in Hawaii can do this while also defending the Central Pacific, then we are facing an enemy who has learned how to make distance an advantage. And that is when the name comes again, not shouted, not used as an insult, but spoken like a diagnosis. Nimitz, April 18th, 1943. Morning light over the Solomon Sea. High above the water, a formation of American P-38 Lightning slices through thin cloud. Twin booms humming, canopies glinting. The pilots fly low and long, skimming emptiness for hours with a precision that feels unnatural. No scouting arcs, no wandering, just a straight line through air that should be too vast to predict. Far ahead, two Japanese G-4M bombers, Bettys, appear as dark specks against the sky, escorted by Zeros. One bomber carries a passenger whose presence makes the escort fly tighter, like guard dogs straining at the leash. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. When the P-38s climb and strike, the scene is quick and brutal. Cannon rounds stitch the air. A Zero rolls and falls away trailing smoke. One Betty catches fire, its wing glowing orange. Then it tips into the jungle below. The other tries to run. But the Americans keep pace as if they already knew the escape route. From the Japanese side, the shock is not only the death, it is the method. Within hours, whispers spread through Japanese naval channels and command rooms. How could American fighters meet an admiral at a specific time, at a specific point in the sky, over thousands of miles of ocean and jungle? Staff officers use careful language. They speak of patrols, of coincidence, of bad fortune, but the faces around the table do not match the words. The faces say the same thing they have been trying not to say since Midway. The Americans are reading the war. As 1943 bleeds into 1944, the sense of being watched becomes a constant pressure. In Truk Lagoon, ships sit under the palm-lined horizon like steel islands. Sailors paint hulls. Mechanics sweat in engine rooms. Pilots walk to briefings with a mix of fatigue and grim pride. The base feels strong, protected, far from Hawaii, far from the American heart. Then February 17th, 1944 arrives. The first sign is the distant growl of engines, growing from a low vibration into a roar that makes heads turn. Lookouts raise binoculars. The sky fills with American carrier aircraft. Hell divers and Avengers and Hellcats, coming in waves that seem to roll over the atoll like weather. Bombs punch into anchored ships, torpedoes streak through water, anti-aircraft guns bark until barrels glow. Truk burns like a city floating on the sea. Japanese commanders had believed the atoll was too distant for a sudden decisive blow. Yet the Americans arrive with carriers positioned perfectly, striking hard, then pulling away before the Japanese can assemble a counterstroke. It feels like a raid designed by a man who knows exactly how long he can stay, exactly what he can destroy, and exactly when the enemy response will become dangerous. In Japanese headquarters, the question changes shape. Not how did they get here, but why did we not see it coming? Admiral Minichi Koga, now Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, stares at situation maps that show American arrows in the Central Pacific. The Gilberts, the Marshalls. Each arrow is a step. Each step is timed. Each step forces Japan to respond, and each response seems to land late, slightly off, as if the Americans have already moved on to the next square. The Japanese try to rebuild a defensive line, to create a decisive battle where carrier strength can be concentrated. Yet the Americans refuse to play the game as Japan wishes. They strike where airfields can be built quickly, where logistics favor them, where submarines can choke routes. They do not take every island. They take the islands that make the next move possible, and the moves come faster than Japanese planners can recalibrate. In late 1943 and early 1944, reports arrive from outposts that vanish in hours. American naval gunfire, amphibious tractors crawling onto beaches, engineers landing with steel matting and bulldozers. Within days, new airstrips appear, and from them, American aircraft reach farther. Japanese officers begin to describe the enemy's tempo like a machine. They coordinate landings with carrier cover and follow on supply, as if the ocean itself is a road they paved in advance. In private meetings, senior Japanese leaders speak the name behind the machine more freely. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific, the man whose headquarters sits at Pearl Harbor, far behind the front, but somehow close enough to touch every operation. A Japanese staff officer, voice low, lays out a timeline of American advances and looks up. This is not the work of scattered commanders acting independently. This is direction from above. Another officer answers with a bitterness that sounds like reluctant respect. He chooses objectives that force us to fight on his terms. By the summer of 1944, the Americans are coming for the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, islands that place American bombers within reach of Japan itself. June 19th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The air above the fleet is crowded with aircraft. Hundreds of them, circling, climbing, diving. Japanese carrier pilots launch into a sky filled with hope and fear. Many of them young, their hands tight on sticks, their mouths dry. They have been told this will be the decisive battle. This is where the Empire's carriers will regain the initiative. But as the day unfolds, Japanese formations run into a wall of American radar-guided fighter control. Hellcats appear at the right altitude, at the right moment, like a door slamming shut. Japanese planes fall in burning spirals. Radios fill with frantic calls. The sea below becomes a graveyard of wreckage and silk parachutes. From the Japanese flagships, officers watch and feel the old story collapsing. This is not simply bravery versus bravery. This is systems versus systems, coordination versus improvisation. And the Americans have built the better system. When Japanese leaders receive the reports, the language grows sharper. Our operations are being anticipated. Our concentration is being disrupted before it forms. One admiral, exhausted, says what many have been thinking since Midway, since Guadalcanal, since Truk. It is as if Nimitz is always already there, not physically, not on the bridge with binoculars, but in the timing, in the choices, in the way American forces arrive not merely in strength, but in the exact kind of strength the moment demands. And as the Marianas campaign pushes forward, Japanese commanders begin to understand the most frightening part. Even when they know the Americans are coming, they still cannot catch up to the pace of the plan. October 23rd, 1944. Sibuyan Sea. The water is a wide sheet of steel under a hard sun, and the Japanese center force pushes forward in a long column, battleships and cruisers cutting wakes that shimmer white on Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. The deck vibrates with the steady power of turbines. Men move with practiced calm, but the calm is thin. They know the Americans are hunting. Admiral Takeo Kurita stands near the bridge windows and watches the sea like it might betray him. His mission is clear. Drive through the Sibuyan Sea, pass San Bernardino Strait, fall upon the American landing forces at Leyte, and smash them. It is an operation built on audacity because only audacity remains. Japanese planners have split their remaining strength into multiple forces, hoping to confuse, to lure, to strike at the exposed flank. It is the kind of plan that once would have belonged to Japan. Now it feels like a plan built to survive an enemy who refuses to be fooled. The first American air attack comes like a sudden storm. Carrier aircraft appear high and then dive, screaming down with bombs and torpedoes. Anti-aircraft guns open up, black puffs blossoming around the attackers. The gunners track targets with clenched jaws, firing until their shoulders ache. Kurita watches a cruiser take hits, list, then slide out of line trailing smoke. He watches sailors run across decks that have become hot plates. He watches torpedoes cut through water with deadly calm. The Americans strike in waves, with timing that feels organized beyond what Japanese eyes can see. The attacks do not come randomly. They come as if each wave has been told precisely when to arrive, precisely what to hit, precisely how long to stay before the next wave replaces it. Kurita's staff tries to estimate the carrier locations. They use bearings. They use the direction of aircraft approach. But each estimate feels like chasing a shadow that moves before you can touch it. And yet the American carriers are not even the only threat. Submarines prowl the approaches. In the days before Sibuyan, Japanese heavy ships have already been ambushed, torpedoed, sunk. The sea itself has become hostile. In Japanese command rooms, the frustration hardens into something like awe. The Americans have made the ocean transparent at the same time. Farther north, another Japanese force moves as bait. Admiral Jisaburo Osawa's carriers, stripped of experienced pilots, sail like decoys. Their flight decks hold aircraft, yes, but many of those aircraft exist more as symbols than as weapons. Osawa knows his purpose. Draw the American fast carriers away from Leyte so Kurita can strike. It is a plan that depends on the Americans making a certain choice. The Americans do make that choice, at least for a time. They race north to engage Osawa. The Japanese carriers are battered and sunk. It is a sacrifice that achieves part of its goal. But when Kurita emerges at Sama, when he finally sees the American ships he has sought, what greets him is not helpless transports. It is resistance. Tiny escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts throw themselves into the fight with a ferocity that feels insane. They lay smoke. They charge. They launch torpedoes. They fire until barrels glow. American pilots take off from short decks in aircraft loaded with whatever weapons are available. Sometimes only machine guns and empty racks. Yet they dive anyway, again and again, creating the illusion of a larger carrier force. Kurita, looking through binoculars at the chaotic sea fight, faces a reality he did not expect. The Americans are not behaving like a wounded animal. They are behaving like a coordinated organism. Even the smallest units are acting in ways that serve the larger plan. And once again, Japanese officers feel that pressure of something above the immediate battle. The Americans have prepared for this kind of chaos. Their communications, their doctrine, their willingness to improvise within a larger framework. All of it points to a command system that has been trained to absorb shocks and keep moving. In Tokyo, the senior admirals receive fragments of reports from Leyte Gulf. The scale of the battle is enormous, and yet the conclusion keeps returning like a drumbeat. Even when we create confusion, they reorganize faster than we do. Even when we lure them, they recover. Even when we strike, their timing counters it. Admiral Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet by this stage, reads and rereads the situation summaries. The paper in his hands is dry, but the content feels soaked in salt and blood. He is trying to shape a decisive battle out of a war that is no longer shaped by Japanese preference. He thinks of the American command network, the speed of their logistics, the way their carrier groups appear with fuel and ammunition and replacement aircraft, even after heavy operations, the way their submarines cut Japanese supply lines with a persistence that feels relentless, the way their landings are supported by naval gunfire and air cover that seems to arrive on cue. It is not one battle. It is the pattern of many. A staff officer, careful, says that American industrial capacity is overwhelming, that numbers win wars, that Japan is being crushed by material. Toyoda does not deny that, but he also does not let it become an excuse. Numbers alone do not explain why Japanese plans keep meeting resistance at the critical point. Numbers alone do not explain why the Americans keep appearing where they will do the most harm. In a private exchange, a senior admiral murmurs something that will never be printed in a communiqué. Their commander understands the sea better than we assumed. He does not mean seamanship. He means the sea as a network, as distance, as time, as logistics, as intelligence. He means that the Americans have turned the Pacific into a controllable space. And behind that transformation, the name returns again, Nimitz. Not because Nimitz personally commanded at Sama or Sibuyan, but because Japanese leaders can feel the structure he helped build. The Pacific Fleet as an engine, the ability to shift forces between fronts, the ability to synchronize attacks so that Japan never gets to breathe. In late 1944, as the Philippines campaign grinds on, Japanese admirals begin to speak differently in their internal meetings. Less about glorious, decisive battle, more about exhaustion, about attrition, about an enemy who will not be tricked into overextension. They have watched American commanders absorb blows and keep coming. They have watched American carrier groups regroup with speed that Japanese planners cannot match. They have watched American landing schedules continue despite storms, despite kamikaze attacks, despite losses, and they have started to say, in words stripped of pride, they always arrive prepared, they always arrive together, they always arrive at the right time. One Japanese staff officer, voice hoarse after nights without sleep, says it in the simplest way. It is like fighting tomorrow, because by the time Japan reacts to what the Americans did today, the Americans are already doing something else. January 1945. A cold wind moves across the inland sea, carrying the smell of winter and coal smoke. In staff rooms and bunkers, Japanese naval officers gather around maps that have grown crowded with red circles and erased lines. The Pacific has shrunk. What once felt like an empire of islands now feels like a corridor closing in. The tone is different now. Not frantic, not hopeful, not even furious, tired. The Americans are landing at Luzon. They are preparing for Iwo Jima. Okinawa looms like a shadow on every chart. Japanese commanders still talk about decisive battle, but the words have become ritual more than belief. The reality is that the Americans choose the place, choose the timing, and arrive with the weight to make it final. In a naval headquarters room lit by a single harsh bulb, a senior Japanese admiral runs a fingertip along the arc of American advances. He pauses at the Marianas, then the Philippines, then the new circles closer to the home islands. He speaks softly, as if volume might invite punishment. Their tempo has never truly broken. Another officer replies with a bitterness that has lost its heat. Because it is planned, it is sustained, it is supplied. What the Japanese are confronting is not only the courage of American soldiers and sailors, it is the architecture behind them, the supply convoys that arrive as if on rails, the shipyards that replace losses, the ability to repair, refit, and return carriers to sea. The way submarines and aircraft patrol lanes until Japan's merchant fleet becomes a set of empty numbers. And behind the architecture, always, there is coordination. That word becomes a curse in Japanese discussions, because it describes the thing Japan cannot reclaim. Japan can still fight fiercely. It can still inflict pain, but it cannot make the Americans lose their rhythm. February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima. The beaches are black volcanic ash that swallows boots. Marines step off landing craft into a wall of fire. Japanese defenses are layered and hidden, tunnels and pillboxes. Guns that do not reveal themselves until the moment they fire. From the Japanese perspective, this is the kind of battlefield that should punish the enemy. And it does. Americans fall in rows. Smoke and sand fill the air. The island shakes under naval bombardment that feels like the world cracking. Yet even here, the Americans keep the schedule. They bring in more men, more tanks, more ammunition. They rotate units. They build airstrips under fire. They turn the island into a machine platform, and Japanese defenders realize, day by day, that the Americans are not simply taking ground. They are constructing the next move while still fighting the current one. Japanese naval officers reading the Iwo reports feel a familiar weight in their chests. Midway was surprise. Guadalcanal was struggle. The Central Pacific was pattern. Now, in 1945, it is inevitability. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. The American Armada is vast enough to make the horizon look crowded. Ships sit in layered rings. Radar pickets on the edges. Carriers farther out. Battleships and cruisers ready to pound shore positions. Transports unloading endless lines of men and equipment. The Japanese response is desperate. Kamikaze attacks rise like angry insects, diving into ships with engine screams and sudden blossoming fire. The damage is real, horrifying. Sailors are burned alive. Ships are torn open. Yet the American fleet absorbs the punishment and keeps operating. Carriers continue launching sorties. Repair parties work, then work again. To Japanese eyes, it is like hitting a mountain with a hammer. Somewhere in the Japanese chain of command, the conversation turns from how to win to how to make the Americans pay enough that they negotiate. And even that hope fades as the American strikes intensify, reaching deeper, faster, more coordinated than Japanese planners can counter. In late spring 1945, in a quiet room where senior officers speak in low tones, someone brings up the name that has hovered over their war for years. Nimitz. The way it is spoken now is different from the way it was spoken after Midway. Then, it was a mystery, a suspicion, an uncomfortable respect. Now it is almost a symbol. Not a single man, but the embodiment of the American command system in the Pacific. One officer, older, voice rough, says what he has come to believe. He always had the initiative because he always knew what mattered. Another adds, almost reluctantly, he did not chase glory. He chased position. They begin to describe the difference in styles like men dissecting a duel they lost before they understood the rules. Japanese doctrine had sought the decisive battle, the single clash that would resolve the war. But the Americans, under Nimitz's theater-level direction, built a campaign that was a chain of problems, each one forcing Japan to spend strength, each one setting up the next. And if you look back, Japanese leaders realize the chain began early. They recall how quickly American carriers responded after Pearl Harbor, how the Americans chose Midway as the place to stand, how they persisted at Guadalcanal, how they learned to coordinate radar, fighters, and carrier groups, how their submarines tightened the noose, how they leapfrogged islands, refusing to bleed for every rock, choosing instead to make some garrisons irrelevant. The Japanese had thought they were fighting fleets. They were fighting a mind that understood how to use fleets. In July 1945, the Japanese Navy is a shell of what it once was. Fuel is scarce. Training is limited. Ships that remain are trapped, targets rather than tools. The officers who once imagined an empire spanning the Pacific now look at maps that show circles closing around the home islands. In that atmosphere, Japanese admirals stop asking how the Americans were always ahead. They know. The Americans combined intelligence, logistics, and operational timing in a way Japan never matched. And they had leaders who could coordinate it without losing sight of the goal. There is a moment, late in the war, when a Japanese staff officer lays down a report and stares at his hands as if they belong to someone else. He speaks quietly to the man across from him. "We were outmaneuvered before we were outfought." The other man nods. No anger, no argument, only a resigned clarity. Because the war has taught them, again and again, that the enemy's commander did not need to be everywhere to be ahead. He needed a system that could see, decide, and strike faster than Japan could adapt. And that is what Japanese admirals ultimately said, in their own careful, often private language, as the Pacific closed around them. Not that the Americans were lucky, not that the Americans were reckless, but that the Americans were coordinated, that their timing was exact, that their command was effective, that Nimitz, and the structure he led, kept turning Japanese plans into yesterday.